Philadelphia, early April 1792. The capital is still a kind of experiment. Mud, brick, and ambition. The air carries damp wood smoke. Horses clatter over the uneven streets. Inside, the quiet is sharper. Paper, ink, and the soft scrape of the chair against the floor. A bill sits on the president's desk. Not a treaty, not a declaration, not a battle plan. A math problem. How many seats in Congress, and who gets them? George Washington reads without speaking. His face gives almost nothing away, but the room is not calm. Because everyone here understands the real stakes. If you control how representation is measured, you control what the country becomes. On the surface, it's technical, ratios, divisors, fractions. Underneath, it's primal, power and permanence. Supporters of the bill say it's practical, it's reasonable, it's fair enough. Critics say it bends the Constitution, that it quietly manufactures extra seats under the cover of arithmetic. Washington spent his whole life watching power hide inside systems. He learned it in war. The side that controls logistics can outlast the side that controls rhetoric. The side that controls the map can decide where battles happen. And the side that controls the rules can win without even firing a shot. He sets the bill down. He reaches for his pen. This is the first time any American president has done this. Washington vetoes the bill, not over war, not over corruption, over representation, over the conversion rate between people and power. And that's the hook for our whole series. The fight isn't always who wins elections. Sometimes the fight is over who gets to design what winning even means. This is Lines of Power, Episode 1, Before the Gerrymander. We're doing a complete history of gerrymandering in the United States, how it evolves, why it pays, and what it does downstream when political competition gets engineered out of the system. And we're doing it with one guiding attitude, calm skepticism toward concentrated power. Not my team versus your team, not slogans, and not a morality play with one villain and one hero. This story is older than modern parties, and it's used by whoever has the pen. The incentive doesn't care what label you wear. Today's question is simple. What is gerrymandering before the word exists? Before the salamander-shaped district? Before the famous Massachusetts scandal? And before the cartoon that makes the practice feel like a novelty? The answer is that the physics arrive first. Because the real engine here isn't a clever politician, it's the structure of district-based, winner-take-all representation and the temptation that it creates. One discipline note before we go. I'll separate facts from interpretation, and I'll do my best to flag anything that needs tighter sourcing. No fake quotes, no mind reading, and no this caused everything. Just mechanisms, scenes, and the incentives that keep pulling people back to the same playbook. Let's build the model. So what happens to a republic when politicians can set the rules for who counts and how? We're going to move through 3 layers. First, the basic mechanics, why geography becomes strategy. Second, the constitutional design, how federalism and election rules create a permanent battlefield. Third, a real early case, a proto-gerrymander aimed at James Madison and why it matters. And we'll end up with teeing the moment in 1812 when the monster finally gets a name. Start with the uncomfortable fact. Representation in America was never an unfiltered expression of the people. It was always an argument about what the people are and who gets to speak for them. In the colonial period, legislators were often built around counties, towns, and property. Voting rules were restrictive. Representation followed status as much as it followed bodies. And when populations shifted towards ports, towards frontier settlements, the map didn't automatically update. In other words, the mismatch between political boundaries and human reality is not modern, it's native. But even if you wiped away every colonial restriction and started fresh, even if everyone could vote and every vote counted equally, you'd still face a problem. Because representation requires boundaries. You have to decide which voters are grouped with which voters. And in a system where each district elects a winner, boundaries are destiny. If you only remember one thing from this episode, remember this. Districts are a machine. They convert votes into seats. And machines don't care about your intentions, they care about inputs and design. So here's the simplest model possible. Imagine a state with 100 voters and 5 seats. That's about 20 voters per district. Now imagine the electorate is close, something like 52 to 48. Here's the part that most people miss. Statewide totals don't automatically just become seats. Seats come from how voters are grouped. So a line can decide whether a 52 to 48 split becomes 3 to 2, 4 to 1, or even 5 to 0. There are 2 classic ways to group them if you're trying to tilt outcomes: packing and cracking. Packing means you concentrate your opponent's voters into a small number of districts so they win those seats by massive margins, essentially wasting voters in that district on both sides while you win more seats by tight margins in the surrounding districts. Say the line drawers want to help yellow, even though yellow is slightly behind statewide. They find the greenest city, one dense area, and draw 2 districts that scoop up as many green voters as possible. Those 2 districts might end up 80% green each. Green wins those seats, but wins them by huge margins, and that extra vote cushion doesn't earn them extra seats. Now the remaining 3 districts are built from suburbs and rural areas where yellow has the advantage. Those 3 might end up 55% yellow each. Green wins 2 seats by a lot, yellow wins 3 seats by a little. Same voters, same preferences, just different grouping. An example was in North Carolina's 2023 congressional map. Districts 2, 4, and 12. They were made even more Democratic through packing additional Democratic-leaning voters into them, helping the overall map tilt Republican. Now take the opposite approach. Instead of packing green voters into a couple districts, the line drawers split the green city into pieces like slicing a pie. Each slice gets attached to a different set of yellow-leaning suburbs or rural towns. So instead of 2 districts that are 80% green, you get 5 districts that are 52% yellow and 48% green. Green loses narrowly everywhere. The result? Yellow wins 5 seats by little, green wins 0 seats despite being close statewide. That's cracking, breaking up your opponent's voters so they're always just short of a majority. An example was in Maryland 2011, where Democrats turned the formerly reliably red 6th district blue by siphoning off Republican voters and adding heavily Democratic areas near Washington, D.C. The Brennan Center for Justice describes it as explicitly packing and cracking to minimize Republican strength. That's the trick. It's not magic, it's arithmetic and geography. It doesn't require ugly, tentacle-shaped districts. Sometimes the most effective map looks perfectly respectable. And once you see that, you see the real prize. It's not just about winning the next election, it's controlling the rules that decide what winning looks like. Because if you can turn 52 to 48 public into a 4-1 seat split, you don't just gain power, you make that power stick. Which brings us to the question beneath every map fight. Why does this pay so well structurally, even in a country that says it's built on consent? The incentive is the heartbeat of this whole series. If you can reduce competition, you can reduce accountability. And if you can reduce accountability, you can grow power with less resistance. And that shows up everywhere, not just in elections. It shows up in budgets because fewer competitive elections make it easier to spend without fear. It shows up in civil liberties because concentrated power is rarely shy about expanding surveillance and enforcement tools. It shows up in foreign policy because a less accountable political class can drift into entanglements that voters wouldn't choose if the costs were fully priced in. Now let me be careful. Gerrymandering doesn't cause all of that, but it can contribute by weakening one of the few restraints politics naturally has: competitive pressure. Now, before we get into the early republic, we have to understand something older. Americans didn't invent the idea that representation can be designed, they inherited it. So let's go back briefly to the colonial era, where you can already see the habit: representation as a tool, not a given. Picture an assembly room in the colonies: wooden benches, a draft under the door, candlelight softening sharp edges. Men argue about representation like it's a moral question, and sometimes it is, but it's also, always, an allocation problem. Which places get seats? Which places keep seats? Which places lose seats? Is representation about people strictly counted, or is it about places and interests, ports, plantations, frontier colonies? In many colonies, representation doesn't perfectly track population. Some towns keep their voice because they're older. Some counties hold influence because they control trade routes, land, or elite networks. And in the background, you can already hear the logic politicians will use forever. Changing representation is destabilizing, preserving it is prudent, and what you call fairness depends on where you sit. Fact: colonial representation schemes often reflected property, geography, and established interests, not clean population equality. The interpretation is that the habit this creates is powerful. People learn that the map and the seat count are political terrain. And when the United States is born, that habit doesn't disappear, it becomes federal. By the time we reach the scene, the first census has already done its quiet work. It's turned bodies into numbers, numbers into totals, totals into claims. Every state can look at the count and see the same thing. It's not just population, it's leverage. So what is the bill we're talking about? It's an apportionment bill, a piece of legislation meant to take the first national census and convert it into a seat count for the House of Representatives divided among the states. And in late March 1792, Congress sends that bill to the president for approval, and a few days later, it comes back. One credibility note before we step into this room: early congressional debates weren't recorded like modern transcripts. What survives cleanly is the House Journal and Washington's written objections, so the quotes you hear in this scene are anchored to those texts. Philadelphia, early April 1792. The chamber tightens, paper moves, benches creak. Tobias Lear, Washington's secretary, delivers the returned bill and objections. At the clerk's table, the House clerk, John Beckley, receives it into procedure. The House Journal captures the pivot point when Washington's objections are read into the record and made permanent. John Beckley, quote, "The said objections were read in order to be entered at large on the Journal," end quote. Those objections are the president's written case against this specific apportionment method, the way the bill turns census totals into seats. This is the first presidential veto, and it lands on representation itself, the conversion rate between people and power. Washington's objections are not a rant, they're a constraint being installed. First, the bill's outcome can't be explained by a single consistent rule. In other words, one rule must produce the outcome. George Washington, quote, "There is no one proportion or divisor which applied to the respective numbers of the states will yield the number and allotment of representatives proposed by the bill," end quote. That's a systems warning. If you can't show your work with one consistent method, you're not following a rule, you're using discretion. And discretion is where incentives hide. Then, the constitutional ceiling. George Washington, quote, "The number of representatives shall not exceed 1 for every 30,000, and the bill has allotted to 8 of the states more than 1 for every 30,000, end quote. That's the real reason this scene belongs in a story about gerrymandering before the word existed. Because apportionment is upstream. Before anyone draws a district line, apportionment decides how many seats a state has to fight over and how much influence it gets to convert into power. When Washington vetoes the apportionment bill, he's not just vetoing a number, he's vetoing the idea that representation can quietly be tuned, while still pretending it's a fixed measurement, realizing that that is the easiest way to tilt representation, tilting the measuring stick. Before the gerrymander has a shape, it has a principle. Power tries to choose the measuring stick. The 1790 census is not just paperwork, it's an act of statecraft. Enumerators move across towns and counties, writing names, or just numbers, into ledgers. Who lives here? How many? How old? And then, quietly, comes the most political question. Who counts for representation, and how? Because the Constitution didn't just say, represent the people, and walk away. It struck bargains, compromises designed to get a country off the ground, compromises that immediately decide who gains leverage and who loses it. Start with the big one. The House is supposed to reflect population. The Senate is not. The Senate reflects states, equal weight, no matter the size. That's not a bug, that's a trade-off. Small states get protection from being swallowed. Big states get a House that scales with people, and the new federal government gets a structure that can actually be ratified. Then there's the compromise that turns the census into a moral and political fault line: slavery. The Constitution's original apportionment rule counts free people fully and counts enslaved people as a fraction for representation. So the census isn't just measuring population, it's measuring political power under a formula that includes human beings who can't vote, yet still increase a state's representation. And the same basic counting logic is tied to taxation too, because early on, representation and direct taxes are linked in the same constitutional machinery. So when you hear the first census, don't picture a neutral spreadsheet. Picture a lever, a measurement that will decide how many seats you get, how much influence you wield, and how much bargaining power you carry in every fight downstream. That's why apportionment explodes into conflict so quickly, because once you've counted the people, you still have to convert the count into seats. What method, what ratio, what rounding rule. Those sound like technical details, but they're where advantage hides, because small changes in conversion can create real seats, real power, real outcomes. Before we move on, a quick note on courts. In the modern mind, a dispute about election rules feels like something a court should decide. But early America doesn't treat courts as the default referee for political engineering. A lot of these fights live in legislators, because that's where the incentives live. The Supreme Court is still defining its role in the constitutional system. That matters later, a lot. But in 1792, the big constraint is not a judge. It's the Constitution's text and the norms leaders are trying to set. The count is only the raw material. The fight is the conversion, how bodies become seats, and how the fight walks straight into Congress next. Remember, the census isn't neutral in the system. The Constitution is a stitched-together bargain. House seats, scale of population, Senate power doesn't. It's also a bargain built with slavery inside the formula, boosting representation through people with no political rights. And early federal design ties the same population math to taxation as well. So apportionment isn't an afterthought. It's the moment that compromises become numbers, and once they become numbers, they become power. Now comes the procedural muscle, the part listeners today rarely picture. A veto doesn't just create an argument. It triggers a test. Can Congress override? And overriding isn't a majority mood. It's a supermajority requirement, 2/3. The House votes, the override fails, and the journal records the outcome with the same bluntness it used to record the message. House Clerk John Buckley, quote, "And so the said bill was rejected, 2/3 of the House not agreeing to pass the same," end quote. No override, the veto holds. And notice what happens next, because this is where incentives show themselves. The incentive doesn't vanish, it reroutes. When a system learns where the boundary is, the next move is almost automatic. You design right up to it. Early on, the counter move isn't a single reform, it's an instinct. An argument that legitimacy requires consistency, transparency, and constraints, especially around representation. Washington's veto is one counter move, not a policy victory, but a boundary set in public, in writing, in the record. And this is why the story of gerrymandering doesn't begin with the tentacle-shaped district or even with the 1812 Massachusetts salamander cartoon that gives the practice its name. It begins earlier, upstream, at the moment the country realizes you can fight over representation without touching a map, by fighting over the method that turns population into seats. The problem is that constraints are expensive. They limit what you can do when you're in charge, which means you have to believe you'll want the same limits when your opponents are in charge. That's a hard sell in politics. Virginia, 1789, the first congressional elections under the new Constitution. The country is still deciding what kind of unit it is. Suspicion runs hot, especially among those who fear the new federal government will consolidate power at the expense of local autonomy. James Madison is a symbol of the new system, the kind of person whose defeat would feel like a referendum. Patrick Henry is a symbol of the opposite direction, famous, influential, and wary of centralized authority. Virginia has to draw districts. Counties are grouped, boundaries are set. Historical accounts describe contemporary accusations that district lines were shaped to make Madison's race harder. This is an early version of the same temptation. Don't just beat the candidate, choose the electorate. Madison's opponent is James Monroe. Now, discipline. Fact. Madison ran against Monroe in 1789 and won. Interpretation. In winner-take-all districts, arranging the district can be as decisive as the debate on the stump. Verification note. The strongest claims about deliberate targeting should be checked against primary correspondence and state records. Voting is public. People state their choice out loud as it's recorded. Logistics matter. Rides matter. Turnout is not automatic. Madison survives the test. By a margin that reminds everyone, structure and organization can decide outcomes long before any national myth gets written. Let's talk consequences carefully. Line manipulation doesn't explain everything. It's not the master key, but it can push the system in predictable directions. 1. It can reduce competition. Safe seats don't require persuasion. They require maintenance. Think of today's incumbents in Congress. 2. It can shift accountability inward. If the real threat is the primary and not the general election, the incentive becomes pleasing a narrower audience, like the Somali communities in Minnesota and Maine. 3. It can change what gets legislated, not because maps cause policy, but because they filter what kind of politicians survive. This corresponds with the term uniparty. 4. It can degrade trust. When people believe outcomes are designed upstream, debate downstream starts to feel staged. Think Fox and CNN. From the lens we're using, the warning is structural. A system of fewer competitive checks tends to grow a political class that's less constrained, less careful, more comfortable with power. Not inevitable, not automatic, but more likely. So here's the core mechanism of episode 1 in one sentence. In winner-take-all districts, controlling how votes are converted into seats becomes a quiet path to durable power. Next episode, we'll go to Massachusetts, 1812, where the trick gets a shape and a headline, and American politics gets a new word for an old behavior, a salamander in ink. And the question that follows us through the rest of the series: when politicians learn they can choose their voters, how do voters choose them back? Thank you. This has been Eli's Edge Podcast. Please like, subscribe, leave any feedback or suggestions in the comments. My goal here is to talk about anything from politics to history to geopolitics, economics, sports, really anything I find interesting. So your feedback will go a long way. Thank you again, and I'll get the next episode out as soon as possible. Thank you.